What is going on, guys? Welcome to The Reformed Reader, the common sense media of BookTube. My name is Josh, and today we are going to be doing a book review of The Bound and the Broken series by Ryan Cahill. Now, before we jump into the review, let's first go over what is this series about. Etheria is a land divided by war and mistrust. The High Lords of the South squabble and fight, only kept in check by the Dragon Guard, traitors of a time long past, who serve the Empire of the North. In the remote villages of southern Etheria, still reeling from the tragic loss of his brother, Caitlin Breyer prepares for the proving, a test of courage and skill that not all survive. But when three strangers arrive in the village of Milltown with a secret they are willing to die for, Caitlin's world is ripped from under him, and he is thrust headfirst into a war that has been raging for centuries. There is no prophecy. His coming was not foretold. He bleeds like any man, and bleed he will. Okay guys, for any of you who are new to the channel, the way that I normally structure my reviews is I go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good being the things about the book that I enjoyed, the bad being the things that I didn't care so much for, and these are preferential things like maybe a character I didn't like, or the writing style, or a setting, those kinds of things. But then I go into the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into this work that might hold a Christian back from picking it up. And I break that down into 5 categories. But before we dive into the review, I just want to give a disclaimer and say that I'm going to be reviewing the entire series up to the most current book as of the time of recording this, which is Of Empires and Dust, because that is the only one that I have not read. So I've read all of the novellas and all of the novels up through Of War and Ruin. And so Of Empires and Dust is still on my TBR. I'm waiting to get to it. But as you guys can see, this thing is massive and the books keep getting longer and longer. And so I'm going to have to spend like a full month and dedicate it to this book, probably sometime early 2026. So just know that ahead of time that this is a series review that is current up through Of War and Ruin, but I have yet to read Of Empires and Dust. So without any further ado, let's jump right in and go over the good. So what are some things about this series that I enjoy? Well, first and foremost, if I'm just being transparent with you guys, as I always try to be, this is the first Dragon Rider fantasy series that I've ever read, and I am absolutely loving it. It is fantastic. It isn't just well written, but the story will pull you in very, very quickly. So there's quite a bit about this series that I like, and I will try to condense this as much as possible. The first thing is the characters. The characters are fantastic. We typically follow 3, at least early on, we follow 3 main characters, with Caitlin being our main protagonist out of the group. And then you have some subsets of characters that tend to branch off, and you follow these other plot lines. And as you go further into the books, those characters and those worlds and those plot lines get more and more vast, which shows you how interwoven this world is, which leads me to the next point, which is the world building. The world building is crazy good. It is so good. There is a lot here to love. Yes, it's sort of that quintessential Dragon Rider fantasy series. It's sort of set in a medieval type of time. So for some people, the world building may seem basic, but that's only for those who are looking at it surface level, because this really does have some very, very deep roots. So the world building is great and the characters are phenomenal. But what's my favorite part about this series? The dragons. The dragons are awesome. I know that people have compared this a lot to Aragon, and I can see why. There's a lot of similarities there. And Ryan Cahill definitely wears his influences on his sleeve a little bit, at least early on, but not in a negative way. I don't think this is a ripoff or anything like that of these other series. And that may be a common complaint among quite a few people, but it's just that Dragon Rider fantasy trope that we all know and love. So if you loved Aragon, I definitely can see how you will love these. If you loved Game of Thrones, I can definitely see how you will love these books as well, because it is a similar story. It is familiar, but that does not mean that it lacks originality, because I definitely think that it is quite original in nature, especially when you start really branching out into some of the other characters. And I don't want to get too far into it, but some of these factions of these knights are, it's top tier writing. So the characters, the world building, the dragons, the magic system is pretty cool. It's pretty unique. There are things that are familiar to me, which I personally enjoy, because I don't like always having to start a fantasy series and have to learn all of this lore before I can get into the story. I'm not saying that I dislike that, but I don't like having to do that all of the time. And this series doesn't do that. When they talk about elves and dwarves, you know what they're talking about. You know what to expect. When they talk about orcs or trolls or giants, those types of creatures, Cahill doesn't have to lean too far into, okay, well, let's pause for a second and decipher or break down all of the intricacies of these characters, so that way you know exactly what we're talking about, because I tend to get bombarded with that. I personally prefer to be given some characters, to be given some of that background, but then to be thrust into the story. And as the story progresses, yes, you can build upon the lore. You can do more world building. You can learn the magic system along with the characters. I love those kinds of stories where we're not just taking a break and, okay, now we have to explain. I much prefer a show rather than tell. I do understand that sometimes that is necessary either way, but I think the best authors, in my opinion, when it comes to fantasy, are those that are able to convey that information without just giving you a list of information. Maybe you're learning alongside a character, which does tend to happen in the story, and I really enjoy that. That puts far less limitations on Cahill's world building, because he doesn't break down, okay, here's the laws and the rules of the magic system. He kind of explains a lot of the magic system in a similar way that Lord of the Rings does, where if somebody says, well, how is this person able to do that? And the answer is magic, right? I like that. I like having some mystique behind the magic system. That's what makes it magic. Otherwise, it would just be science. I know that tends to be a common theme. It's like, well, magic is just science that we can't explain yet. And so Cahill does an excellent job of sort of leaning into that without just giving you a non-answer. He does give you answers, but they're not going to be completely satisfactory if you're wanting to get in the weeds of, how does this work and how does this faction deal? Like, you don't need all of that. He just has a very specific story that he wants to tell in a specific way, and he is able to do that. But another key thing that I love about the series is that there is a clear delineation between good and evil. There's that clear delineation between the two. Yes, I do enjoy a morally gray character. Yes, I do like when our authors kind of tend to blur the lines a little bit and you have to look at nuance. I do enjoy those kinds of stories. But what I don't enjoy is when they take an evil character and we are forced as a reader to sympathize with them based on the way that it's written. What I would much rather have is have a character that's evil and us be able to understand his motivation, but without us buying into that motivation. And I use this comparison a lot, but it's like Thanos. One of the reasons why I love Thanos as a villain is because he's the bad guy. He's a villain. He's out of his mind, but you understand his motivations. You never agree with the outcome. You never agree that, the answer is to destroy half of the universe. No, clearly there are other options. And so in this story, you're dealing with a similar type of good and evil. Good is clearly good and the evil is clearly evil. And it's not just the guy that's, the evil villain that's twisting his mustache. It's not that kind of a villain. There are some of those in here, but they do explain their motivations, which makes the world feel lived in and real without us having to completely empathize with them and say, oh, I don't just understand, but now maybe the bad guy isn't so bad. I do not typically like those kinds of stories. I typically like to have my fantasy stories to be good versus evil and good win most of the time. And so this is that type of story thus far. So this leads me into the bad. So what were some things about the series that I wasn't so crazy about? And again, these are preferential things. And let me start off with the elephant in the room, which is that these books are enormous, right? This book right here, I think is like just sub 1,500 pages. And I think of War and Ruin as like right there with it, if not maybe a little bit thicker. And the books are so long that Ryan had to change his font size in order to get these books to be able to print hardcover, because the machines that the machines that the publisher uses physically could not print more pages into a book and still hold it together. So yeah, these books are infamously long. Now, that doesn't mean they're bad, but they are long. I will also say that that doesn't mean that they're bloated. Now, is there a little bit of bloat? Sure. But if I'm being completely transparent with you, I think there is more bloat in book 2 than there is in book 3. And that's really saying something. So what were some things that I don't necessarily care for? The length. I think maybe he could have broken these up into smaller books or a larger series over time. That's my personal opinion. I also prefer to have my chapters be shorter. And so the chapters are typically pretty long. And the farther along you get into the series, the longer the chapters seem to be. I tend to be a short chapter, short book kind of guy. And I would rather have most of the time those kind of either split up or to maybe tighten everything up into a more succinct story. So yes, they are long, which means it's going to be an investment. So for somebody that's a slower reader, you can definitely expect to spend quite a bit of time on these books. I think of War and Ruin took me all month last year to get through. So yeah, it's lengthy. Doesn't mean that it's bad, but it is lengthy. I will say, however, that you get a lot of bang for your buck. So each of these books are very similar in price for you, the customer. So yeah, you get a lot for your money here, because again, these are hardcover. I've got the older self-pub indie edition hardcovers, and each one was between $20 and $30. So when you see the size comparison between the book 1 and book 4, and they're relatively the same price, yeah, you get a lot more story for your money, which is a good thing. So, there are some trade-offs to the length. So another thing that's not my favorite thing to do in fantasy books is to have a vast amount of POVs. I think, again, as you go further on in the books and further on into the series, you're going to have more points of view. I think in the first book, we had 2, maybe 3 points of view or perspectives, and that was really about it. And then in book 2, he added a POV or 2. And then in book 3, he added more, and so on. And so eventually these names and these characters can tend to blend together, especially when you're using all these fantasy names and all these fantasy villages and towns and cities. And so you're like, hold on, like, where am I at? So you can get lost in the weeds a little bit. I personally prefer to have maybe no more than 5 POVs, and that sometimes can even be a lot for me. Another personal preference of mine is that book 2 is my least favorite of the bunch so far. It was a little convoluted. It almost seemed like Cahill didn't really know where he wanted to go in book 2. It wasn't bad. Again, I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy it. I did enjoy the story quite a bit, but there was a section where they're in some mines where it just kind of drug on for a while, and it certainly pulled me out of the story, because I knew, okay, I'm going to have to trudge through these mines with these characters a little bit longer. It just wasn't my favorite section of the book, and it is most certainly my least favorite section of the series so far. So book 2 did tend to drag on a little for me, but other than those things, I don't really think there's a lot here to complain about. So I personally have really enjoyed this series, so I plan to continue the series very, very soon, and I'm really looking forward to it. So this brings me to the ugly, which is what could be some sin that is steeped into the series that might hold a Christian back from picking it up. And I break this down into 5 categories, and I rate them out of 10, starting with violence and brutality. Now, again, I do want to preface that I am rating the series as a whole up to of War and Ruin, so keep that in mind. So I'm going to try to give you the average of all of the books, including the novellas. So for violence and brutality, I'm going to give this a 7. It's about what you can expect from a Dragon Rider fantasy. There isn't really a lot of people that are safe. There's a lot of big epic battle scenes, but like I said, if you like Aragon, you'll like this. If you like the Song of Ice and Fire books, I think you'll really enjoy these. I definitely think that the violence and brutality is probably toned down in comparison. So as far as the violence and brutality goes, I would say it's probably PG-13. Yeah, there are some pretty hardcore battle scenes. There's some pretty epic battles. There's some pretty epic fight scenes. There are some descriptors used, but I don't think that it is overdone or gratuitous in any way. So for me personally, I'm going to put it about a 7 because I don't know that I would hand this to my 12-year-old son and say, here, read this. But I definitely think for somebody that is, 14, 15 years old, I think if they pick this up, they'll be just fine as far as the violence and brutality goes. So this leads me into category 2, which is sexually explicit content. Now for sexually explicit content, I'm going to give this a 6. Now, again, I am including the novellas. And so if I'm talking about the novellas as well, the novella, The Exile, introduces a character that, Ryan Cahill has described as not heterosexual or homosexual or even bisexual, but he has described her as just sexual. And you definitely can see that, especially in that novella, in one scene in particular, and in some flirtatious banter back and forth with a few characters. So yeah, it's in there a little bit. There was one point in The Exile made me kind of pause and pump the brakes and just kind of go, okay, is this going too far? And for me personally, for my personal taste, it didn't cross that threshold. It definitely towed the line at one point. So at its peak, I will say it will toe that line a little bit, but for the vast majority of the series, it's just not in here. So this leads me into category 3, which is language. And for language, I'm going to give this a 4. Yeah, there's some language in here, but it's not heavy. There are some heavy hitters in here, but they are sparse. They are few and far between. Again, this isn't something that I would necessarily hand my 12-year-old son as far as the language goes, but I think an adult will be just fine. I'll say if I were to rate this based on a movie, I would say the language here is PG-13. You can expect a couple of bombs. You can expect one of the ones that really bothers me. It is in there, but I mean, there's a lot of words here. So you're going to find most of the words somewhere in this series. I don't think it's really heavy-handed. There are times where it can be heavier than others, but overall, for the majority of the series, I would put it at about a 4. So this leads me into gratuitous inclusions. Now for gratuitous inclusions, I'm going to give this a 0. Now you might be wondering, well, how can you give this a 0 when you talked about that certain character and the sexually explicit content? Because I don't think Cahill wrote it in there to be gratuitous in any way. I don't think he was doing it to be inclusive, to be like, oh, look how edgy I am. Look how new age I am. I don't think that whatsoever. I think he just had a character in mind, and that is what the character's qualities and traits were. Again, the category is gratuitous inclusions, and so I don't think the things that some people might call inclusive were gratuitous in nature or had any sort of ill intent. I just think he's looking to tell a Dragon Rider fantasy story that is aimed and targeted for adults, and I think he's done a good job of that thus far. And so this leads me into the final category, which is dark themes. Now for dark themes, I also include heavy themes, and these are things that might weigh on your conscience, things that maybe you might wrestle with, a day or two later, things that, I'm not saying that you will contemplate. I'm saying things that are like, that kind of weighed on me, and maybe I shouldn't be dwelling on these things. And so for dark themes, I'm going to give this like a 1. And really, I would probably give it a 0, but I'm going to give it a 1 just for anybody that maybe is a little more cautious and errs on the side of caution a little more even than I do about these things. I don't really think it's in there, but there are some things, there are some heavier topics maybe that are talked about in here. But again, it's not heavy-handed. It is not in your face. It is not a main plot point or anything like that. It maybe is sprinkled in there. I don't recall anything, but just to play it safe, I'm going to put it in a 1. So this leads me to the final question, which is, would I recommend it to a Christian? And the answer is probably. It's just going to depend on the individual. I will say I would probably recommend this series to an adult that loves fantasy, or an adult that is looking to get into fantasy, especially a dragon type story. Now, for anybody that's interested in this story, and I do highly recommend it to anybody that's like, they love fantasy, but they're just not really sure. The first novella, which is called The Fall, Ryan Cahill offers it for free on his website still to this day. And it is not very long. I would pull it out, but it's wedged under all these massive tomes. But he does still offer it for free. And it definitely gives you that taste so that you know what to expect from him as an author. And so he kind of puts his best foot forward. And I think he's even described that in a couple of interviews where he says, look, if you're not sure whether or not you will like my writing, read this novella first. And I think most people can read it in one sitting. It's like 50 pages maybe. Read this first. And if you don't like that, you're probably not going to be on board with the series. But if you really like that, then I think you will be on board with the series. And I think you can trust me to get us there, because it's not going to be pedal to the metal right out of the gate. He's definitely going to build up to it. And with each book, you do have those peaks and valleys as far as when things are really moving or when we have those contemplative moments, those types of scenarios. So if you're sort of like, well, I am an adult that is really looking for a good fantasy series, a good Dragon Rider fantasy series where it's good versus evil, but I'm just kind of unsure, and this seems like a daunting stack, read The Fall first. That's what I did, and I really enjoyed it, and I think that's the way to go for most people. I know a lot of people have now said to read book one and then a novella between. I actually think the story is better served if you read the novella The Fall before the others, because it does give you a little bit of history and background that sets the stage for what's to come. So overall, guys, what did I think about The Bound and the Broken so far? I've absolutely loved it. For any of you that have watched my top 10 fantasy series, it's in here. For any of you who've watched my top 10 favorite fantasy authors, he's on there as of right now. So yeah, I am really, really enjoying these books, and I do plan to get to A Vampires and Dust very soon. I'm just having to fit things in when I can, because my TBR is piling up. And so I'm going to have to start prioritizing the books that are on my shelf and quit bringing new things home. But I do plan to get to A Vampires and Dust early on next year. But yes, I am absolutely loving this series. And I think for anybody that is a big fan of fantasy, that is a big fan of dragons, that is a big fan of epic battles, and that even is a big fan of Star Wars, I think you'll find a lot to love here about this series. So thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out with me and listening to me ramble about some dragon books for a little while. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. But more than anything, please share these videos with your Christian brothers and sisters, because it is my goal with this channel to be a good resource to my brothers and sisters in Christ, so that maybe we can spend our time, money, and energy a little more wisely on things that honor the Lord. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.